The climate crisis is the single greatest threat to life as we know it. As we continue to burn fossil fuels and our planet heats up, storms are getting more intense, sea levels are rising, wildfire season is growing, and energy-related economic and political chaos is spreading. And while the age of outright climate denial may be coming to an end, we don't all agree on how or how quickly to combat the crisis. Welcome to the Climate Debates from Rolling Stone. Hi, I'm Jeff Goodell, contributing editor of Rolling Stone. Welcome to another installment of Rolling Stone's Climate Debates. Today, we're going to debate the risks of depending on natural gas as an energy source. The big question here is straightforward. Can we continue to use natural gas for energy and still maintain a habitable planet? Right now, natural gas is used to generate about 40% of the electricity in America, an amount that roughly doubled in the last decade due to cheap fracking and the displacement of dirty coal. The gas industry likes to promote natural gas, which is less carbon intensive than coal, as a bridge to a clean energy future, as well as a necessary energy source upon which modern life as we know it depends. But is that true? The climate crisis is a problem created by burning fossil fuels, and natural gas, like coal and oil, is a fossil fuel. Here to debate this today is Julian Brave Noiscat, a writer, advocate for Indigenous people, and the Vice President of Policy and Strategy for Data for Progress, a progressive think tank. Joining us is Arvind Ravikumar, an assistant professor of energy engineering at Harrisburg University of Science and Technology in Pennsylvania. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Colorado School of Mines, as well as at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. We're going to break this debate up into three sections, each that'll run about 10 minutes. The first 10 minutes will be about natural gas and the climate crisis. The second 10 minutes will be about the politics of natural gas. And the final 10 minutes will be about natural gas and climate justice. Then we're going to do a few minutes of rapid fire questions in which I'll ask Julian and Arvind for 1-minute responses to a variety of subjects. So let's get started. Arvind, let's go to you first. Mm-hmm. Can you explain to me and to us why in a world that takes climate change seriously, we should continue burning natural gas?
Great question. Thanks for having me, Jeff. So, one of the things that we should get out of the way is that, we have to reach net zero emissions by mid-century. This is something that scientists say that we have to get to address the climate crisis. And this is, at this point, this is even something major oil and gas companies are saying. Whether they're really committed to it or not is something we'll have to see. But achieving net zero by mid-century is not something that's debated. So the question then becomes, how do we get to net zero emissions from where we are? And what I want to emphasize here is that natural gas is very different from energy sources such as coal because it is deeply embedded in our economy. Natural gas is one of the largest inputs in terms of energy and fuel in the power sector, in the industry to develop fertilizers, as well as in the residential and commercial sectors where we use natural gas to build to heat buildings. Now, the challenge with transitioning away from natural gas from all of these sectors are several. There's political challenges, there's technical challenges, and there are social adoption related challenges. And the biggest issue in the system is inertia. For example, in the power sector, we know what to do to get rid of natural gas or to get to a near zero emission system. Massively expand renewable energy and use natural gas just for say, in periods when the demand is very high. But the question is, can we get there? In the power sector, we know the answer. But in the building sector or in the industry, if you look at what we have right now, buildings are 30, 40, 50 years old. Until switching our entire stock of millions of homes from using natural gas currently to a low carbon or a zero carbon system is going to take decades. And so the question is not why do we have to use natural gas? The question is, in the time that we have 30 years from now to 2050, what steps do we have to take now? So when we get to 2050, we are able to achieve that net zero emissions that everybody wants to.
Julian, what do you think? I mean, is it possible to get to net zero by 2050 in the kind of way that Arvind just talked about kind of using natural gas in a kind of a better way and sort of gradually moving away from it? Or is it something we need to get off right now?
So firstly, I just want to thank you, Jeff, for the invitation. And obviously, it's great to be in conversation with Arvind, whose work I have admired from sort of the far side of the Twitter and internet portal for a while. So it's great to be in conversation, at least over the Zoom machine. I think that, listen, the technical aspects of a lot of this stuff is quite complicated. And I will be upfront in saying that I am a policy analyst and advocate, and am not an expert on, some of the technical specifics here. But I think that it's a fair summary of, especially recent research on, in particular, the issues related to methane emissions and the potential for high methane leakage, that we need to, and in particular by we, I mean policymakers, need to be really readjusting the way that they have thought about natural gas, or what some advocates and researchers are increasingly calling fossil gas, in the sort of energy mix, and in our sort of broader economy and society. And essentially what that research suggests, right, is that there used to be this view that natural gas could be a bridge fuel. This was the term that was used and popular during the Obama years. The notion that natural gas, as you said in your introduction, Jeff, produces less CO2 emissions than coal. And so, in the displacement of coal by natural gas, we were reducing emissions. That picture doesn't look as nice anymore when we sort of are increasingly getting data about sort of rising methane emissions. In fact, there is, I believe, a report from NOAA just today as we're having this conversation about this very topic, that suggests essentially that the amount of methane leakage, some of which can be traced back to the growth and explosion of natural gas over the last decade, is an increasingly important contributor to the greenhouse gas effect, to global warming. And if we're going to take on that challenge, at the very least, I think we need to cease building out natural gas infrastructure and start transitioning to clean energy sources. And here, there is obviously the battery technology can get better, but it's also getting pretty good right now. And there is some research that suggests that batteries can replace small and mid-level natural gas power generators. We also, of course, have the problem of natural gas being in so many buildings. My mom cooks really good food on her natural gas stove, and that's going to take a long time. There's a lot of buildings in this country that have natural gas in them. There's a lot of people like my mom who cook on a gas stove, who are attached to their gas stove, and over a long period of time, we're going to have to electrify all of that stuff. And I think that that's going to be a real area of priority moving forward. I think that natural gas, just to close out my initial points, has often been thought of as, fracking as a thing that exists in our energy system. But I think we've talked a lot less about natural gas in the home, and also the pollution that natural gas can create in the home, right? When we talk about things like fracking, sort of the image is usually a drilling rig somewhere out in Pennsylvania or North Dakota or something like that, and then the pipelines that connect that to global oil markets. But there's so many people who have that infrastructure in a much smaller way in their own homes, and in small, very low risk, but not non-existent risk, are living with the potential harms that can create. And addressing that will increase health outcomes. And I have an electric stove, and I think that you can still cook pretty decent stuff on it, although I can't cook as well as my mom.
So Arvind, Julian brings up a good point, which is, when you consider the kind of climate impacts of natural gas, it's not just about the carbon intensity of the fuel, it's about things like leaking methane. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, right? I mean, how do you calculate that into your kind of analysis of the climate impact of natural gas?
That's a great question, Jeff. And I really want to sort of draw on Julian's important point that you definitely need policy support to transition away from fossil fuels. If we are going to leave it at voluntary mitigation efforts of corporations or utilities or even cities, that's not going to cut it. And methane emissions is a great example example of that. And in our discussion about what's going to happen in 2050, in sort of the broader discussion in the country and the world, we sort of miss the opportunities to do things today that can significantly cut down emissions in the next 5 years. And one prime example is methane emissions from both oil and gas production, but also in our pipelines under our homes. The solutions are there, the technology is there, and it is also cost effective to address these leaks, methane leaks, quickly and cost effectively. The key thing that's not there is a policy support to be able to do that. Of course, big corporations like, I don't know, BP or Shell have their own sophisticated methane mitigation programs that they're doing, but that doesn't mean everybody else is doing it. And to solve this challenge, to make sure that every single operator that's drilling for non-natural gas right now actually reduces their methane emissions, gets to zero flaring and zero venting, which are all attainable goals. It's not that we don't know how to do it. It's just that we don't have the right policy supports and mechanisms to do that. And I think especially the Biden-Harris administration is strongly considering this. There are a couple of bills that are in Congress to make methane regulations much stronger. I think we are moving in the right direction. That's my first point. My second point is right now it's less about climate, but if you're looking at pressure from international climate action, that's becoming a big factor in addressing some of these near-term challenges with natural gas. The EU is moving fast with their European Green Deal. And they're basically saying we don't want gas from the United States because you have too much of methane leakage associated with your production. And so it's sort of putting pressure on US LNG exporters to make sure that whatever gas they get from in the US actually reduces their leakage when they sell it. And so there's so much we can do today to significantly reduce the emissions impact that we're not yet doing. And that's something we need to focus on right now.
I want to move on to talk a little bit more about politics rather than just about emissions and things like that. And Julian, I want to start with you. This is, I know, something that you've thought a lot about. And, certainly during the presidential campaign, during the last year, the way that the conversation about natural gas got articulated is about fracking, right? It was about, do we frack, do we not frack? And we had candidates on the progressive side like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders who talked about banning fracking, and Biden never went that far. Tell me what your research and what your sort of analysis has told you about the kind of support there is out there for banning fracking, and about the political risks and dangers of this idea.
It's a great question, and the answer is fairly nuanced. So I'm going to do my best to recall our data while acknowledging I won't be able to recall like the exact figures by memory. So just to summarize what the essential debate is here, fracking, as we've said, boomed over the last decade. It's hard to understate the extent to which this transformed politics, not just domestically, but also globally. The fact that the United States became the largest producer of oil and gas over the last 10 years can be traced directly to the fracking boom. This had consequences for OPEC and so many other things, and is still entwined in a lot of our sort of foreign policy conversations. And at the same time, that it created an enormous number of jobs in places that also, in some instances, are significantly politically powerful in our unusual electoral system that privileges, particular states that are close to sort of the decider of who will control the legislature or who will win the presidency. And one of those that was of significant consequence and discussion was Pennsylvania, which of course Donald Trump won by a small margin in 2016. And which was viewed as one of sort of the key geographies where Democrats would have to compete in 2020 if the party that I prefer was going to win the White House this time around. And this actually is going to be another question that we deal with again in 2022, as there's going to be a significant Senate race in Pennsylvania. So this question is also going to be important moving forward. And the concerns essentially were that, as Jeff said, progressives and environmentalists want to take aggressive action on fracking. The most clear articulation of this is the idea that we should ban fracking. I think that is probably the furthest left version of the policy interventions. It's worth noting that some countries or some jurisdictions like Scotland have in fact banned fracking. So this is not an unprecedented move on sort of a global scale. But it is certainly sort of the most leftmost demand. And then there are many other sort of regulatory and other interventions beneath that that I think the Democratic Party is wrestling with right now, particularly related to methane regulations. And the essential question here is whether the electorate can go as far in a place like Pennsylvania as supporting a ban on fracking, or whether there are sort of regulatory interventions south of that, to scale down fracking, to regulate it more effectively, to promote clean energy, that we can also, that can also get votes in places like Pennsylvania. And essentially, the place where I would land on this is that the safer bet, the bet that Joe Biden made, was not to support a ban on fracking, which is, of course, the position he took on the campaign trail. And I think if you are a risk-averse person, which is, I think, a diplomatic way of saying if you are a politician who's trying to win an election, I think that was probably the place to bet, put your chips. But at the same time, I actually am not certain that more aggressive regulatory interventions, including potentially, discussing a fracking ban, would have completely killed Democrats' chances of carrying Pennsylvania as we did in 2020. Of course, we can't live in the parallel universe where Biden and Kamala, ran on a fracking ban. But I think that the concern about those kinds of interventions is overblown. And lastly, as we've done, I work for a think tank, as you said, Data for Progress. We do a lot of public opinion research, and at least our conversations with folks on the ground, which is to say our qualitative data, does seem to suggest that, folks who are not necessarily of sort of the left persuasion that I hold, here in the community, that folks do express concerns about fracking, and that this is a more complicated thing in people's lives where views do diverge quite a bit. And I think that moving forward, as the Democrats did in 2020, it's sort of it's a needle that needs to be threaded gently between sort of the policy and scientific needs and political realities that are quite finicky and complicated, particularly when you have an opponent in the Republican Party that is willing to exaggerate or even lie about the position that the Democrats and their candidates are taking.
Thanks, Julian. So, Arvind, you're in Pennsylvania right now. Can you imagine a day when a candidate of either party or any candidate could win a statewide office with advocating a ban on fracking? Are we moving in that direction, or how do you read the politics of that? Because Pennsylvania is a very important state in thinking about this, within the sort of larger context of the country.
So I'm not a political scientist, so I don't know what my prognostications and what politically what might happen in Pennsylvania is a good gauge of the situation. But I don't think people are going to win statewide here if they propose a ban on fracking. And you know what? This is one of my biggest frustrations from the 2020 primary cycle, especially the Democratic side of the debates. Because people get stuck on this, this big, should we ban fracking or should we not ban fracking, when that is sort of largely beside the point when your goal is to reduce emissions and transition off to net zero or like clean energy transitions. And the reason I say this is because when you look at the scientific and the technical challenges of this transition, the best way to limit our use of natural gas is to kickstart and to jump ahead with respect to alternatives to places where we are currently using natural gas. So whether it's subsidies for renewable energy or scaling up massively solar and wind power, or providing tax breaks for homeowners to switch from gas-based utility items like heaters to induction stove or to heat pumps. From the demand side, we need to figure out what's the best way to reduce the use of natural gas, consumption of natural gas, and that will automatically take care of the supply side. So if there's no demand, producers are not going to produce natural gas because the prices would crater and they won't make any money out of it. And so we sort of get stuck on this lightning rod issue of whether to ban fracking or not, when to achieve our goals of zero emissions and transitioning to a clean energy, We have to focus on demand side policies and demand side changes that we need that will automatically reduce our use of natural gas. And I think this is where the Biden administration and President Biden himself was really smart that he said, I'm not going to ban fracking because even if we said that, we know it's not going to happen in the next 10 or 20 years, given the inertia in the system. And so looking at his own climate policies in the American Jobs Plan, see that there's a lot of demand side incentives to reduce emissions. And that's the way to go to address our addiction to natural gas and reducing our natural gas consumption as we look towards 2050.
So, Julian, what would you point to if your goal is to reduce demand for natural gas and to transition as rapidly away from natural gas as possible? What's the single most powerful policy tool out there for doing that? A clean electricity standard? What would you say is the most powerful tool?
Data for Progress worked with Professor Leah Stokes at UC Santa Barbara and Evergreen Action, which is a think tank composed of former advisors for Jay Inslee's presidential campaign, to write a paper about a clean electricity standard. So I should probably plug that paper. And I would also say that there's, I think, compelling evidence and research that would suggest that a clean electricity standard is pretty key to that. Although I think clean electricity standard won't be implemented absent other policy interventions like investments and incentives for clean energy, and that I would argue that they need to come together, that we shouldn't obviously just be passing clean electricity absent those kinds of investments and incentives. I think that there's going to be a huge debate, though, as Congress looks at President Biden's proposal for a clean electricity standard, as to whether and how natural gas fits into that kind of policy mechanism. And just very briefly, there are proposals in Congress around partial crediting of natural gas due to the point that we were making earlier about natural gas having less CO2 emissions than coal. This is a big, wonky debate that exists out there. And it's one where, utilities, which are the businesses that would be impacted by this, not the only, but among the businesses impacted, I think are going to significantly weigh in on the side of partial crediting. And there's also the question, of course, of carbon capture, which President Biden included in his plan, and which I think a number of activists who are on the sort of left side of these questions and are also coming from communities that are impacted by natural gas extraction, transportation, et cetera, are probably going to be weighing in on the opposite side of the utilities and other interests.
We did a whole separate debate on carbon removal technologies and things, but I'm very interested in your view, Arvind, in this context about the potential for that kind of technology in your view with natural gas. I mean, do you see, I know that it's been mostly talked about and deployed on industrial facilities, cement, things like that, and also coal plants. It goes all the way back to FutureGen, way back into the Bush administration and everything. It's a very expensive and complex technology. Do you see it as a dead end for natural gas, or how do you see carbon removal in the context of natural gas?
That's a great question, and as Julian rightly said, it's very complicated given the arguments from a lot of different angles. My own personal view is that it is something we definitely have to move forward with, at least with investments. So there are two parts to this. First is the question of who's promoting carbon capture and carbon removal, and when and where we should do it. I think those are important questions, but those questions are completely irrelevant to the question of whether we should be investing in carbon capture and carbon removal technologies. And I think the answer to the second question is a resounding yes. Partly because worst case scenario, it acts as an insurance for us in case we are not able to rapidly reduce emissions. But the most important part is, I think it sort of brings the other elements of climate action, which is global emissions reductions. Rich countries like the US and the EU have an obligation to draw down emissions that they've already put into the atmosphere. 2C is what we all agree on, but lower is going to be better, because we know that impacts just from going from 1.5 C degrees Celsius increase to 2 C degrees Celsius is going to have massive impacts for people in Africa and Asia and Southeast Asia. And so investing in carbon capture and carbon removal is important because maybe one good use of it is to draw down emissions that we've already put up there. And as you said, it's all in its infancy. It's expensive right now, but we need to start investing right now so that we have the technology. Whether we use it for reducing emissions from industrial activity, or whether we use it to draw down emissions that are already in the atmosphere to reduce temperatures even further.
So let's move on to the last section of this, the last 10 minutes, about climate justice and questions about that related to natural gas. Julia, I guess I want to start with you again about just as fracking was the way that questions about natural gas got articulated in the political campaigns recently, the way that political activism kind of gets articulated around natural gas is in pipeline protests. Can you talk a little bit about why that is and how effective you feel that has been and will be in the future?
Over the last decade in particular, that might only be because I've really only been paying attention the last decade, but I feel like it's been the last decade. There has been a rise in grassroots activism opposed to the construction of fossil fuel infrastructure, and in particular, the pipelines used to transport, oil and gas to market. Some very prominent protests have made national and international headlines. So the Keystone XL pipeline, which is not a natural gas pipeline, was opposed by tribes and environmental activists. And actually, President Biden recently canceled the permit for Keystone XL, which was a more than decade-long goal of the campaigners. Similarly, the Dakota Access Pipeline, was a very prominent project that is still sort of a political point of tension for tribes and environmental activists, for whom there are a number of sort of criticisms and concerns about pipelines. For tribes, there are concerns about pipelines potentially violating their treaty rights. So in the sort of origin of this nation, there were agreements in many instances signed by the federal government and tribal nations. There's actually over 300 of them across the country that essentially made commitments between the federal side and tribes around land cession, and then what tribes would get in return. In many instances, virtually every instance actually, those treaties have been violated or not upheld by Congress and the federal government. And in many instances, tribes feel that pipelines and other projects that are being developed through their treaty lands are being done so in violation of what was written and agreed to in those treaties. And that was a significant point made by activists opposed to the Dakota Access and Keystone XL pipelines, as well as others. Then there is a set of sort of concerns about what those pipelines might do to the climate writ large by locking in the potential for future emissions, as well as to sort of more regional and local environmental and sort of health outcomes. So, in the case of the Dakota Access Pipeline, the concern was that the pipeline went through the water supply of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, as well as through sort of the Missouri River area, which could imperil many people downstream. This was a sort of major effort. Of course, the folks who were opposed to that pipeline described themselves as water protectors, sort of making reference to this issue. Elsewhere, particularly ranchers and farmers and landowners have also opposed these kinds of projects because they imperil their property rights. So the concern here is that eminent domain and other sort of legal pressures have been put on owners of land to grant easements and other things to the pipeline operators to build those pieces of infrastructure.
What happens to natural gas industry and to natural gas in general when you can't build pipelines anymore?
we have a lot of pipelines in this country. They're not going to go anywhere. So even if we stop building pipelines now, you're going to have to fix all the issues with existing pipelines. And we're seeing that in many of your major cities in the northeastern part of the country, where these pipes are leaky, they're old, they're rusty, and those needs to be replaced. To improve safety in these pipelines. There's one thing about not building new infrastructure, but the immediate next question is what are we going to do with existing infrastructure? We have like millions of miles of pipeline literally under our lands. And so the way, a lot of cities and I think natural gas companies as well now are thinking about it is, is there a way to use these things given that it's already there? One of the known options that California is already doing, for example, sort of using landfill gas as part of our natural gas supply. I mean, landfill gas is already created from our wastes. Just put it into the pipeline that already exists to use it. So that sort of reduces the need for additional fracking. Europe and now the United States is starting to think about hydrogen, which is, it's still in research mode, but there are ways, technical ways to generate zero carbon hydrogen, which can be transported through the existing pipeline system. So to your point about natural gas companies, what are they going to do in the future? There are a lot of ideas and there are a lot of ways and there's a lot of research happening where they can transition to becoming a zero carbon company that uses similar, if not the exact same infrastructure, but does not have the detrimental effects of fracking or natural gas. So there are ways to address that. And one of the things that we're seeing right now is individual cities having gas bans. Ordinances, and there's like a lot of fights over that in the state level, doing this in sort of a whack-a-mole way, like each city decided to do it. It's the way our natural gas system is paid for. So if you look at it, the way it basically works is the rates that we pay for our natural gas are set by utility commissions in states, and it's based on the number of customers served, volume of gas that's being used, etc. So if a city decides that we are not going to have gas in any new buildings, what you're going to see happen is that you're going to have a shrinking pool of consumers still with natural gas appliances and natural gas connections, paying an increasingly larger share just to maintain that infrastructure because the bans applied only to new buildings. Or there were incentives that wealthy homeowners took advantage of to switch away from natural gas. So low-income communities and low-income homeowners are saddled with paying with a shrinking pool of consumers for the infrastructure that needs to be maintained. So we need to think more broadly and more holistically about how do we get away from the use of natural gas in communities, in cities, from our homes. That needs to happen at the state level with considerations for who's going to pay for it, who's going to be left behind with natural gas, and how do we make sure the policies that we take to reduce its use are equitable.
Yeah, that's a great point. Julian, when you talk about the pipelines and the pipeline fights, you talked about breaking treaties and, basically a kind of lawlessness. And it kind of brings up an interesting question that I've thought about a lot writing about the fossil fuel industry, which is that, they're an incredibly powerful lobbying industry, and they're, essentially many of them are kind of lawless. They break the rules. They get away with a lot of things. Can you imagine, the gas companies sort of behaving better? Is this an issue of kind of being better corporate citizens, or is this just a fundamental problem of kind of trying to build and erect these pipelines across America?
That verges on a philosophical question about how to organize. Yeah, I think we're on fairly empirically established ground when we say that fossil fuel corporations have not necessarily uniquely bad in the history of corporations, history of doing business, but a pretty bad sort of track record of their relationships to people and communities, particularly who sort of stand near or in the path of the resources that they're trying to get to. I think, though, that what this raises to me and what is a relevant, I think, question, not just in the fossil fuel-based economy, but what will actually be a very relevant question in the transition to a clean energy economy, is what the appropriate sort of policy and regulatory mechanisms and processes there need to be to make sure that communities and indigenous peoples in particular, but also workers and others, have to say in the development of infrastructure and the built environment. One of the things that kind of keeps me up at night when I think about climate action and climate policy is the potential for transmission lines that we're going to need to build out to modernize our grid, becoming sort of the pipelines of the 2020s and 2030s, by which I mean becoming significant sources of grassroots activist opposition. And if we're going to avoid that potential, I think we're going to have to get a lot of the questions that we did not appear to get right in the fossil fuel economy right in the clean energy economy, which I think extends beyond whether the clean energy companies are more moral capitalists than the fossil fuel executives.
I think that's a great point. Arvind, do you want to respond to that at all? You're shaking your head like do you have a final thought you'd like to wrap up with on that?
No, no, I'm strongly agreeing with what Julian has said. And even with methane policy, which is a small part of the issues with oil and gas extraction in general, is that what we have seen so far is there are very few states where companies are proactively addressing their environmental impact. The only places where we see reasonably good reduction in emissions or better environmental stewardship are in places that have strong regulation, are in places that have strong community input into these regulations. For example, places like Colorado and New Mexico are starting to go towards that region. And so going forward, whether it's new pipelines, new infrastructure, or reducing impact from existing activities, a strong collaborative approach with the community and backed up by strong legislative action is the only way to where we can work towards this clean energy transition.
All right. Okay. On this note of agreement, I want to move to the last section of this, which is going to be about 5 or 6 quick questions. Each of you, I want to give you like just a minute to respond. I just want a few thoughts and sentences about this, and then we'll move on to the next one. I'll give you each an opportunity to respond to it. First one, Julian, for you, President Biden just released his infrastructure plan. Give it a grade A to F and tell me why.
I would give him an A minus because I would agree with sort of initial progressive analyses of the proposal that it includes a lot of the breadth of policies that you'd want. I think that he tackles a lot of sectors and he tries to do it ambitiously. But there is an analysis from the Political Economy Research Institute led by Bob Pollin that suggests the investment number should actually be even bigger than the 2 trillion that Biden proposed, and should be more on the order of about 1 trillion per year over 10 years, so 10 trillion, and that level of investment would get us to full employment. Biden talks a lot about wanting to be the next FDR, LBJ. And one thing that FDR and LBJ agreed on is that we should be aiming for full employment.
Okay, great. Arvind?
I would give a B plus. As Julian said, I really like a lot of elements in the plan, including the taxes on household on corporations. But what you see here is that some of the analysis that I've seen shows that over 15 years, the amount Biden is proposing to spend on infrastructure is actually lower than what the corporate tax increases will raise. And I think just given that, and if that's true over 10, 15 years, there's a lot of scope for investing more, maybe add $1 trillion there and really make that investment. Borrowing costs are really low. Economists all over the country have said that that's not going to be a problem. So if he really believes that we need to go big right now to address the climate crisis, I think there's a lot of scope to go even bigger. And that's the only reason I'm giving him a B minus, B plus here.
Julian, what's the biggest media generated myth in the climate crisis?
The myth that belief in science is core to understanding our political circumstances. I think that we often explain away opposition to climate action via some notion that Republicans don't believe science. Republicans don't believe science, and I actually don't think that is the most fitting explanation of their their positions. I think at the end of the day, what they are very concerned about is that um, in a world where we really aggressively take on climate change, I don't think that it's impossible to imagine like ExxonMobil and other things going bankrupt. And I think that's really the real reason they oppose climate action.
Great point. Arvind, biggest media generated myth in the climate crisis.
One of the most frustrating things I see in the media perspective talking about climate crisis is that the only time they talk about climate crisis is, when there's a hurricane or when there's a wildfire in California. And that sort of misses the point. Extreme events and impacts from extreme events are just one of the things how we are impacted by the climate crisis. It's going to get far worse. It's going to become far more chronic. We're going to see the impacts of climate change and the climate crisis on food production, on extreme heat, so many other aspects of everyday ordinary life that gets a little worse every year. We start emitting more and more carbon emissions. And getting that through, telling people that climate crisis is not about just, faster or more powerful hurricanes or extensive wildfires, but about everything that we love and we cherish in our life is something that's important that's not come through yet.
So then I'm going to follow up with the next one with you, Arvind, because this kind of connects with that. The climate crisis is often described as a sort of existential crisis for human civilization.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree with that or not? And if so or not, why?
It's a challenging question because I do think it's an existential crisis, no doubt about that. But what happens that I don't possibly agree with is that people often talk about this as the only existential crisis that we have faced. That's not true at all. We have seen brutal colonization, we have seen slavery. There have been enormous existential crises around the world throughout its history that people have faced. People were staring down a deep dark hole and still come out on top of it with a lot of struggle. And so pretending that this is the first existential crisis we're facing does injustice to all the struggles of the people that came before us. And so I agree that this is one of the existential crises we face. I don't think this is the first one that we're facing.
Julian?
Yeah, I very much agree with what Arvind just said. So as an Indigenous person, I would say that climate change is not the first existential crisis that my people have faced. I think that colonization and genocide and assimilation were world-ending or nearly world-ending events for First Peoples, and climate change is a similarly potentially world-ending event for some communities and societies and places, certainly for many species, which I think we should have some compassion for. But I think that the other side of that is that our species in particular is more resilient. Our cultures are more resilient than I think we sometimes give ourselves credit for. And the other side of the story of First Peoples surviving apocalyptic circumstances is that we're still here. In many instances, we're still speaking and learning our languages and maintaining our cultures. And so I think that you can almost die and come out on the other side with vibrance and love and compassion and all the good things about being a human too. So
who's your climate hero?
I've learned a lot from Bill McKibben personally. I in my own sort of life and career, try to balance, a role as a writer and reporter and communicator with a role as an advocate and sometimes as an activist. And it's hard to do both of those things at once. If you slip too far down the advocate activist role, it's hard to maintain an image as someone who's objective and vice versa. And I think that he's navigated those two things really well. But at the end of the day, I think that my mom is probably the biggest climate hero because she taught me to love. And I think that climate action and justice is going to require a lot of love in the world at a very basic level.
That's great. Arvind?
I don't have one hero. I have several heroes, and my climate heroes are the students I teach. Every single day I talk to them. I teach them about about climate change and what we have to do, and I draw energy from their passion, from their interest in doing this work, despite what we're seeing around the world and how our leaders are reacting to it. They are not bogged down by that. They want to do more, and they're fighting to get there and have their voices be heard. And every day they give me strength to get up and work on this, even so if it's just for them, to make sure that they achieve their goals that they want. So they are my climate heroes.
Really appreciate both of you taking the time to do this. You guys both made great points.
Awesome.
All right.
All right. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah.
Thanks, Al.